The morning sun filtered through the Venetian blinds of a corner office on the 42nd floor, casting parallel shadows across an oak desk. A man sat there contemplating the photograph of himself taken 15 years earlier. In the image, he was younger, hungrier, and infinitely more fearless. He had since become what society called successful, a director of operations at a multinational corporation, a man with credentials, connections, and a salary that would have seemed impossible to his younger self. Yet something gnawed at him with persistent intensity. He had achieved what he thought was his destiny, only to discover that destiny itself might be nothing more than a comforting lie we tell ourselves when we lack the courage to strategize our own futures. This realization struck him not like a thunderbolt, but like water erosion, constant, relentless, and only visible in retrospect. The question that now haunted his morning reflections was not whether destiny existed, but whether the people who succeeded were simply those who had the wisdom to destroy their weaknesses before the world could exploit them. The book on his desk, worn at the edges from constant review, was a dog-eared copy of Machiavelli's thoughts on power, ambition, and the construction of one's own fortress. He had underlined passages so many times that the margins looked like they had been attacked by a mad cartographer. The philosophy of Machiavelli is often misunderstood as a mere prescription for ruthlessness and manipulation. The common reader, swept up in popular discourse, believes that Machiavelli advocated for deception and cruelty as ends in themselves. But our man had discovered something far more profound in those dense Italian sentences. Machiavelli was not writing about how to seduce the world with false charm. He was writing about the brutal honesty required to understand yourself and others without the comfortable delusions that most people wrap around their psyches like security blankets. The genius of Machiavellian wisdom he had come to understand lay not in its advocacy for manipulation, but in its unflinching acknowledgement of human weakness and the necessity of confronting it directly. The man found himself returning to a central observation. Every person he had known who had been truly destroyed by others had first destroyed themselves from within. They had harbored weaknesses they refused to acknowledge, a need for constant validation, an inability to say no, a fear of solitude that made them vulnerable to anyone offering companionship, a hunger for approval that could be weaponized by those with the cunning to recognize it. These internal vulnerabilities were like locks with obvious keys, and the world was full of people with clever hands waiting to turn those keys. Consider the fate of a colleague from his earlier years. A man with genuine talent and creative vision, yet haunted by a crippling self-doubt that made him perpetually seek reassurance from those around him. This weakness became his Achilles heel. A superior, recognizing this vulnerability, systematically fed him false praise while simultaneously taking credit for his work. The colleague found himself trapped in an emotional dependency that replicated the dynamic of a parent-child relationship, and by the time he recognized the pattern, he had been professionally diminished to the point of irrelevance. He had destroyed himself from within. The superior had merely been an efficient instrument of that self-destruction. The man at the desk understood that this principle extended far beyond professional hierarchies. It operated in romantic relationships, family dynamics, friendships, and every other arena of human connection. The people who suffered the most devastating betrayals were rarely victims of superior strategic thinking. They were, more often, architects of their own downfall. They had weak points they hadn't fortified, blind spots they hadn't examined, and character deficiencies they hadn't corrected. They were like soldiers who entered battle with known gaps in their armor, then expressed shock when the arrows found their mark. This realization led him to a crucial question that would consume his thinking. If weakness was the true enemy, was there any meaningful distinction between destiny and strategy? Could what appeared to be destiny, the inevitable unfolding of events according to some cosmic blueprint, actually be nothing more than the predictable consequences of one's own failures to construct an adequate defense against human nature's darker impulses? And inversely, could what appeared to be brilliant strategy simply be the natural result of having eliminated one's own vulnerabilities to the point that one could navigate the world with clarity rather than desperation? The signs that someone is truly meant for you, he had come to believe, had nothing to do with cosmic alignment or soulmate mythology. Instead, they were practical indicators that two people had both done the internal work required to exist in partnership without requiring the other to plug the gaps in their own character. They were people who could be together without needing to be together. A distinction so profound that it overturned most conventional relationship wisdom. The moment you needed someone, you had already surrendered the strategic advantage that comes from wholeness. He remembered reading that Machiavelli emphasized the importance of virtue, not virtue in the sense of conventional morality, but virtue in the classical sense, the capacity to navigate reality effectively. A virtuous person, in Machiavellian terms, was someone who had developed their capabilities to the point where they could not be easily manipulated or destroyed. This was not about being nice or good in any traditional sense. It was about being formidable. It was about understanding that the world operated according to principles of power, and that power flowed to those who had systematically eliminated the weaknesses that others could exploit. The uncomfortable truth, which he had spent years avoiding, was that most people spent their lives developing their weaknesses rather than destroying them. They nurtured their dependencies, reinforced their insecurities, and rationalized their character defects. When they encountered someone who had taken the opposite path, someone who had systematically dismantled their own weakness and rebuilt themselves on a foundation of honest self-assessment and relentless self-improvement, they experienced this person as somehow inevitable in their life. This was the phenomenon mistaken for destiny. The man realized he had been wrong about many things in his younger years. He had believed that love could overcome limitations, that good intentions could substitute for strategic thinking, that vulnerability was a sign of authenticity rather than a tactical disadvantage. These beliefs had nearly destroyed him. It was only when he had started the difficult process of identifying and eliminating his own weaknesses, his need for external validation, his fear of making decisions that would disappoint others, his tendency to compromise his own judgment in deference to authority, that his life had begun to shift from chaos to agency. This shift had nothing to do with destiny, and everything to do with the hard work of self-destruction. He had to destroy the version of himself that sought approval from others. He had to destroy the part of himself that rationalized his compromises. He had to destroy the voice in his head that whispered that other people were somehow more competent, more worthy, more entitled to authority over decisions that affected his life. This internal work of destruction had been more painful than any external setback because it required him to look directly at his own culpability in the failures he had experienced. Destiny would have been easier. It would have allowed him to remain a victim of circumstances. Strategy required him to accept responsibility for the construction of his own weakness. Part 2. The alchemy of self-destruction and the emergence of authentic power. Years into this internal work, the man had developed a framework for understanding how people either rise or descend. It had nothing to do with luck, natural talent, or being born into advantageous circumstances, though these might provide temporary advantages. Instead, it had everything to do with the willingness to engage in what he came to think of as productive self-destruction. The systematic elimination of the character defects, psychological dependencies, and emotional vulnerabilities that made a person an easy target for manipulation and exploitation. He had observed that there were typically 7 primary areas of weakness that, left unchecked, made a person vulnerable to being destroyed by others. The first was the need for external validation. This was perhaps the most insidious weakness, because it was often dressed up in social language and rewarded by conventional society. The person who needed external validation was always available to be shaped by others' opinions, always ready to abandon their own judgment, if doing so would earn approval. He had watched this weakness destroy people with otherwise considerable talent. They had the capability to achieve remarkable things, but their dependency on others' approval made them malleable, willing to compromise their work, abandon their intuition, and reshape themselves according to whoever held power over their validation in that moment. The second weakness was the inability to tolerate solitude. The person who could not bear to be alone would make virtually any compromise, accept virtually any condition, rather than face the emptiness of their own company. He had known women and men alike who had remained in clearly destructive relationships because the alternative, being alone with themselves, was unbearable. This weakness was particularly powerful as a weapon, because the moment you knew someone could not tolerate solitude, you knew you had leverage. You could threaten abandonment, and they would capitulate to almost anything. The man realized that solitude was not something to fear, but something to cultivate. A person who could genuinely enjoy their own company, who could find meaning and interest in their own thoughts and projects, was essentially invulnerable to this particular form of manipulation. The third weakness was what he called strategic dishonesty, the subtle ways that people lied to themselves about their own motives, capabilities, and circumstances. This was more dangerous than external dishonesty because it operated below the level of conscious awareness. The person who deceived themselves about their true capabilities would invariably overreach and create vulnerability. The person who rationalized their compromises would find themselves trapped in patterns of behavior that worked against their own interests. The moment you stopped lying to yourself about what you actually wanted, what you were actually capable of, and what you were actually willing to accept, you gained an enormous strategic advantage. The fourth weakness was the absence of genuine expertise. The man had noticed that people often made a grave error. They assumed that confidence could substitute for actual knowledge and skill. But the world had a way of revealing this gap, and when it did, the unprepared person found themselves at the mercy of those who had done the harder work of actually developing competence. He had invested years in becoming genuinely expert in his field, not for the external rewards this might bring, but because expertise was a form of power that could not be taken away. You could lose money, status, and relationships, but genuine knowledge and skill remained yours alone. The fifth weakness was moral inconsistency, the gap between what a person said they believed and how they actually lived. This weakness made a person deeply vulnerable because it meant they were always exposed to the possibility of exposure, always managing a gap between their public persona and their private reality. Moreover, this internal inconsistency made them vulnerable to their own poor judgment, because they were not operating from a coherent value system. The man had realized that genuine power came from aligning his beliefs with his actions to such a degree that there was no gap for others to exploit. He did not pretend to be more moral than he was, nor did he behave in ways that contradicted his stated principles. This integrity was not about being good in a conventional sense, it was about being coherent. The sixth weakness was the lack of genuine relationships. Relationships based on mutual respect and authentic regard rather than manipulation, dependency, or utility. The person who had no one they could genuinely trust, no one who would support them without condition, was deeply vulnerable. Such people were forced to manipulate every relationship, to maintain constant social performance, to never allow themselves to be known. This exhaustion made them prey to anyone offering genuine connection. The man had gradually surrounded himself with people who knew him as he actually was. Flawed, ambitious, sometimes wrong, but honest. These relationships were far more valuable than any network of superficial connections based on mutual usefulness. The seventh weakness was the unwillingness to cause pain when necessary. This was perhaps the most misunderstood weakness because it was often confused with kindness or compassion. But the man had learned that a person who was incapable of delivering disappointment, of saying no, of ending relationships or situations that no longer served either party, was vulnerable to endless entanglement with people and circumstances that diminished them. True compassion, he had realized, sometimes required you to cause short-term pain in the service of long-term integrity. The ability to make hard decisions without being paralyzed by the discomfort of others was not cruelty. It was necessary power. The process of eliminating these 7 weaknesses was not a project that could be completed and then abandoned. It was ongoing, because the world was always seeking out weaknesses, always probing to see where a person's defenses were porous. The man had come to see that what people called bad luck was usually simply the result of having left vulnerabilities uncorrected until someone with intent exploited them. But something remarkable happened as he methodically addressed these weaknesses. The quality of his life transformed not through external manipulation or strategic maneuvering, but simply through the elimination of the internal vulnerabilities that had made him a suitable target for manipulation. Fewer people tried to control him because they quickly recognized that they lacked leverage. He attracted different kinds of relationships. People who respected him, rather than people who needed him to serve a function in their own psychological economy. His work improved because he was no longer making decisions based on what he thought others wanted, but based on what he actually believed was right. His health improved because he stopped making compromises with his own well-being to accommodate others' comfort. Most significantly, he stopped experiencing his life as something happening to him and started experiencing it as something he was actively constructing. The situations that others dismissed as bad luck or attributed to destiny, he came to understand as the entirely predictable consequences of weaknesses he had since eliminated. The opportunities that others attributed to destiny or being in the right place at the right time, he recognized as the simple result of being the kind of person who could recognize and exploit opportunities, because he was not distracted by the need for validation or consumed by the anxiety that comes from internal inconsistency. This was the Machiavellian wisdom that had been so misunderstood. The path to power and resilience was not through the manipulation of external circumstances, but through the honest, often painful reconstruction of one's own character. Machiavelli had understood that weakness invited exploitation. Therefore, the elimination of weakness was not a matter of psychology or morality, but a matter of survival and effectiveness. A man who had destroyed his weak self was indeed a man who could never be destroyed by others, not because he had become ruthless or cruel, but because he had eliminated the vulnerabilities that would give others leverage. The man often thought about the people he had known who had experienced what they called destiny, the sense that events were unfolding exactly as they were meant to, that they had found their path, met their soulmate, discovered their purpose. In every case, he had observed that these people had something in common. They had done the internal work to eliminate their obvious weaknesses. A woman he had known had experienced destiny, meeting her partner only after she had worked through her need for external validation and learned to trust her own judgment. A man he had worked with had experienced destiny in his career only after he had developed genuine expertise and stopped seeking approval from authority figures. People who experienced what felt like destiny were simply those who had reconstructed themselves to such a degree that they could recognize and pursue what was actually right for them. The question of whether they were meant for each other was really a question of whether both people had done enough internal work to be able to relate authentically rather than from a place of need and manipulation. When two people who had both eliminated their primary weaknesses came together, it felt miraculous precisely because it was so rare. Most people were still operating from a foundation of fundamental insecurity and unaddressed weakness, so they could only relate to each other through the lens of those weaknesses. They clung to each other not because they were meant for each other, but because they served each other's psychological dysfunction. The man realized that his younger self would have found this philosophy cold and cynical. But it was neither cold nor cynical. It was simply clear-eyed. It acknowledged that human beings were capable of both greatness and degradation, and that the difference between the two often came down to whether they were willing to do the harder work of self-reconstruction rather than seeking external solutions to internal problems. Part 3. The synthesis of destiny and strategy in the construction of resilience. By the time the man had reached what he considered the integration phase of his understanding, he had come to a surprising conclusion. The debate between destiny and strategy was itself a false binary. What appeared to be destiny was simply strategy so thorough and so well executed that it looked natural, even inevitable. What appeared to be strategy was simply the practical application of having eliminated enough weakness that one could navigate life with authentic clarity rather than desperation-driven manipulation. He had begun to mentor younger professionals, and he noticed something curious. When he would explain to them the principles he had come to understand, the necessity of eliminating weakness, the importance of genuine expertise, the power that came from integrity, they often resisted. They wanted to believe there was some trick, some secret strategy that would allow them to bypass the difficult work of self-reconstruction. They wanted to believe that success was about knowing the right people or learning the right moves, rather than about fundamentally upgrading the quality of their own character and competence. This resistance was itself a weakness, he recognized, because it meant they were refusing the only path that actually led anywhere. He began to understand that the signs that someone is truly meant for you, in romantic relationships, friendships, or professional partnerships, were not mystical or cosmic. They were entirely practical. They were the signs that you were both people who had done enough internal work to be able to meet each other authentically rather than from a place of need. They were signs that you both had the capacity to tolerate disappointment, to admit when you were wrong, to change your mind based on new information, to prioritize truth over comfort. They were signs that you could be together without requiring the other person to complete you, validate you, or give your life meaning. The man had noticed that people who were perpetually seeking the one were usually people who had not done enough internal work to be able to exist fully as themselves. They were looking for someone to fill the gaps in their own character, to provide the validation they had not learned to generate internally, to make their life feel meaningful because they had not learned to do that for themselves. Their desperation to find the one was inversely proportional to their wholeness. The moment they stopped seeking and started focusing on the work of self-reconstruction, they either found themselves alone, which was not nearly as terrifying as they had anticipated, or they found themselves with someone who met them at their actual level of development. This was the Machiavellian wisdom applied to relationship and meaning. The signs that someone is truly meant for you are the signs that both of you have eliminated enough weakness that you can actually choose to be together from a place of freedom rather than necessity. When both people had developed the capacity to be alone, they could be together because they wanted to, not because they needed to. When both people had developed genuine expertise in their own domains, they could respect each other's capabilities rather than competing for dominance or seeking to control each other. When both people had achieved a degree of coherence between their beliefs and their actions, they could trust each other because they were not constantly managing a gap between appearance and reality. The notion of destiny, he came to understand, was the comfort story that comfortable people told themselves. It allowed them to believe that something larger than themselves had made their choices for them, which meant they bore no responsibility for understanding why they had chosen what they had chosen, or for changing course when the path they were on was clearly leading somewhere they did not want to go. Destiny was what you believed in when you had not yet accepted responsibility for constructing your own life. Strategy, by contrast, was the path of the person who understood that no external force cared about their well-being, their happiness, or their fulfillment. Strategy was the recognition that they would have to build the life they wanted through the systematic application of will, intelligence, and honest self-assessment. Strategy began with the acknowledgement that you were responsible for your own weakness, and that no one was coming to rescue you from it. This acknowledgement was simultaneously the most depressing realization a person could have and the most liberating. It was depressing because it meant you could not blame your failures on bad luck or injustice. It was liberating because it meant you had the power to change everything by changing yourself. The man had discovered that the people who appeared to be living lives of destiny, people who seemed to move through the world with clarity, who attracted good circumstances and good people, who seemed to find love and success with an ease that others attributed to luck, were simply people who had done the internal work to eliminate enough weakness that they could operate from authenticity and strength. They had not been given special advantages or secret knowledge. They had simply been willing to do what most people were not willing to do, face themselves honestly, and reconstruct what needed to be reconstructed. When a woman or man entered his life who seemed like they were meant to be there, it was not because destiny had arranged it. It was because both of them had done enough internal work that they could meet each other without the distortions that desperation and unaddressed weakness created. They could see each other clearly. They could communicate directly. They did not require the other to manage their emotional states. They could respect each other's boundaries because they had established their own boundaries and learned to maintain them. The man often reflected on the phrase that had become central to his thinking: "The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others." This was not a prescription for becoming hard or cold or invulnerable in the emotional sense. It was a description of what happened when a person took responsibility for their own character and made the difficult choice to eliminate the weaknesses that made them vulnerable to manipulation, exploitation, and heartbreak. Such a person could not be destroyed by others because destruction requires leverage, and weakness is the mechanism by which leverage is achieved. This did not mean such a person was immune to loss or pain. It meant they could experience loss and pain without it destroying them, because their sense of self was no longer dependent on external circumstances or the opinions and behaviors of others. A person who had not learned to generate their own validation could be destroyed by rejection. A person who could not tolerate solitude could be destroyed by abandonment. A person who lied to themselves about their own motives could be destroyed by exposure. But a person who had done the work to eliminate these weaknesses had a resilience that nothing external could take away. The man began to see his own life not as a series of fortunate coincidences or a path laid out by destiny, but as the entirely predictable result of having gradually upgraded his own character and competence. The relationships that worked were the ones where both parties had done enough internal work to be able to meet as equals. The professional opportunities that came his way came because he had become the kind of person who could recognize and execute on such opportunities. The sense of meaning that had come to pervade his life came not from external circumstances, but from the alignment between his values and his actions. This understanding transformed his approach to mentoring and to his relationships with others. Rather than telling people what to do or trying to manipulate circumstances on their behalf, he would point them back to themselves. He would ask them to identify the weaknesses they had not addressed, the character defects they had rationalized, the dependencies they had not resolved. He would tell them, with as much kindness as he could muster, that there was no amount of external strategy that could compensate for internal weakness. You could not manipulate your way out of a character deficit. You could not fake your way to genuine relationships. You could not achieve real power while remaining dependent on others for validation. The most difficult conversations he had were with people who came to him seeking the secret, the trick, the strategy that would allow them to succeed without doing the internal work. He would watch their faces fall when he would explain that there was no such thing. Success, genuine success, came only through the methodical elimination of weakness and the deliberate construction of genuine competence, integrity, and authenticity. There were no shortcuts, no hacks, no clever ways to avoid the difficulty of becoming a better version of yourself. Yet the people who heard this message and actually accepted it, who actually committed to the difficult work of self-reconstruction, were the ones who went on to experience what others called destiny. They found relationships that worked. They found careers that satisfied them. They found themselves living lives that aligned with their actual values rather than the compromised versions they had been living before. And they did this not through external manipulation or clever strategy, but through the unglamorous, difficult work of honestly assessing their own character and reconstructing what needed to be reconstructed. The man realized that the Machiavellian wisdom he had come to embody was not the cynical, manipulative philosophy that popular culture suggested. It was actually the most optimistic philosophy imaginable because it acknowledged that you had the power to change your life by changing yourself. It was not a philosophy of fatalism or victimization. It was a philosophy of radical responsibility and radical freedom. It said, "Your weakness is your responsibility, and therefore your elimination of that weakness is your power." As he considered this understanding, in the quiet of his office, with the afternoon light replacing the morning shadows on his desk, the man felt something that he had rarely felt: certainty. Not the certainty that came from having all the answers, but the certainty that came from understanding the principles that actually governed how life worked. He knew that the young people coming into his life who seemed to be on a path of genuine success were the ones who had accepted this understanding. He knew that the relationships that would actually sustain him would be with people who had done the internal work to be able to meet him authentically. He knew that his continued development came not from seeking external advantages, but from maintaining the relentless focus on identifying and eliminating new weaknesses as they emerged. And perhaps most importantly, he understood that the question, "Is this person meant for me?" was actually the wrong question. The right question was, have we both done enough internal work that we can meet each other without the distortions of desperation and weakness? The answer to this question could not be found in destiny or romantic intuition. It could only be found through honest assessment of the work that both people had done on themselves. The man returned to the photograph on his desk, his younger self, full of hunger and fear and unexamined weakness. He did not regret that younger self. That version of him had been necessary to get him where he was, but he was grateful every day that he had eventually accepted the difficult path of self-examination and reconstruction. He was grateful that he had learned that destiny was a comforting fiction and that strategy, real strategy, began with the willingness to see yourself honestly and change what needed to be changed. In the end, the man understood that the only sign that someone is truly meant for you is the sign that both of you have destroyed the weak versions of yourselves enough that you can meet as whole people. And the man who has destroyed his weak self can indeed never be destroyed by others, not because he has become hard or ruthless, but because he has become whole.